It's lovely to be here with you, Zooming, and I'm going to start with some of my very early work, which I did in the 70s. And at that time, as a young artist, I was very interested in the relationship between art and nature. There were many, many artists who were a generation ahead of me who were working outside in the desert and out in the land, and it was called land art. And that was the time of Robert Smithson and the Spiral Jetty and Mike Heiser and a whole group of artists who were trying to work with nature and make art in relationship to it. And so I started to make these pieces inside in enclosed spaces that were sort of metaphorical, trying to set up a kind of metaphorical relationship between what I was doing and the natural world, almost like an experiment. And so my very early work took several thousand pounds of sand, set it in the center of the space, and put fans around it. And I expected to make a kind of whirlwind, like a dust devil. And instead, I made these sort of little dunes. And what I was thinking about is this, and this is followed throughout a lot of my work, the phrase, the necessary structure and the contingent event. The structure was the pile of sand with the fans, and the event was what happened, almost like an experiment. And then the next work I made, I took a lot of dry clay, I mixed it with water, and I poured it into these plywood compartments, and I let it crack, just like the earth, and cracks when it dries up in the sun. And I wanted that to be, what I really wanted to do at that point in time was to set up a situation and then allow whatever was going to happen. And I would sort of have to accept it. So those were very early works that were made in 1971, 72, somewhere around that time. At some point, I was always very, very drawn to architecture as a kind of overall sort of art form that everything else worked in terms of. And I thought of architecture as very culturally responsive to whatever historical period it was in, and that also dealt with society, the politics of the society. And so I thought, what's the earliest form? One of the earliest forms of architecture was a labyrinth. And I was also, as a young artist, and so you see here a picture of the maze, which was made on a farm in Pennsylvania. And it was made like a stockade, like a fence. And it was how I sort of learned to actually build what was in my head. I could draw it, I could plot it out, I could imagine it, but how was I going to build it? And so I went out to the land, I got some help with some carpenters, and I learned how to plumb things up, dig holes, make things level, and site something on the land. Now, this swirl around the maze was made by the cars of young people discovering this on a farm and driving up to it and using it. What I wanted to do was to set up a situation, the necessary structure, which was the maze, the architectural situation, and the contingent event being how you moved through it. And the other issue for me, labyrinths have gone on throughout all of history, mazes, labyrinths. They've always been used in a kind of metaphorical way. They've always been used as a kind of rite of passage, as sort of the journey through life. And I was also at the time, as a young artist, graduate student, doing a research paper on the highway system. And I thought a highway, when you see it from above, and if you take away the notion of arrival and departure, is like a vast maze or a labyrinth. So again, I wanted to set up a kind of metaphor for the architectural world, so to speak, or highways. Um, I felt as though I was starting with very early architecture and I was learning it and I was visiting. I went to Greece and I went all over France and England, and I went all over the southwest of the United States looking at underground kivas. And I looked at many different books, and I was imagining and fantasizing. And so I thought, well, I'm going to start with the beginnings of architecture. So there's a piece called Low Building with Dirt Roof, which I sort of picked up as a kind of earth house related to some of the sort of dwellings that people made in America when they first got to America. And also I was thinking of the tombs in Greece, in the tomb of Agamemnon and and the beehive tombs, but these were little sort of triangular tombs. And so one of the things about the structure of the low building, which you see in the top, is that when you crawl in, you can feel very safe. It's got 7 tons of earth on top. You can feel very safe, but you can also feel as though you're being smothered. And that's very much like if you think of it as your first home. You feel safe, and then sometimes you feel like it's just claustrophobic, like it's too much. And those two, the necessary structure, the contingent event, and those feelings of back and forth, attraction, repulsion, seduction, and fear, that moving between those poles are poles that I have used throughout my career. And that kind of sort of spectrum of feelings. And what I wanted to do was to set up sort of architectural situations that were psychological. And I had to give these architectural situations a function. They weren't going to exist in the real world as functional buildings. So their function was to create psychological feelings in the viewer. The underground piece that you see below, you would see something, and this has been, a lot of these pieces have been, they were built in the 70s and they were recreated much later from original drawings. And so the underground piece below, you see these sort of openings on the surface of the earth. Then you crawl down in ladders and you go from light to dark to light to dark in these kinds of underground bunkers, which are very much, again, like all the underground dwellings that I had seen in America, in the Native American dwellings, and also places in China, and also from fiction. Now moving along to the concrete piece again, and I was looking at paintings, and I kept trying. Some of my favorite painters, Bosch and Bruegel, and I would imagine, well, what are those buildings like? What are those structures like? And I think this came from either a Bosch or a Bruegel painting that I had seen, and it also kind of looks like a silo. So there it is on this farmland. You approach it, you have a ladder, and you put the ladder up and you look down and you see these sort of circles within circles within circles, and you could climb down inside. And at the same time I'm making these pieces, I'm learning how to build for real, not just to think and design, but thinking is very important, but actually how to build. But most of these works existed as photographs, and the art world at the time really saw photographs. They didn't actually experience the work. Now they get to experience them when we've rebuilt them in art parks in America. Moving on down, I started to build the stairs, and I started to build inside and to try to create these architectural experiences. And stairs have always fascinated me as a vehicle. They ask you to perform on them. And then, so again, you've got the structure and the event. And what I liked about these stairs, and these stairs get recreated from exhibition to exhibition, you climb up, and as you're getting higher and higher, you get closer to the ceiling, and at some point, you can't stand up. So there's this kind of paradox, and the stairs go nowhere, which is in some cases like life. Sometimes you start on a path and you go up the stairs and you have to go back down again. And so there was always this kind of paradox that I would try to insert into these early architectural pieces. And again, these are little architectural follies. The one on the left is at the Museum of Modern Art, and you can't get in it, but you can look in it and imagine yourself climbing through it. The one on the right begins a shift. I had seen on the pages of a magazine called Scientific American an article about the beginnings of technology and industry and the Industrial Revolution. And it was an article about wind power. And there was a beautiful little drawing painting of a windmill structure. And of course, we believe that the Industrial Revolution started sometime in Holland with harnessing wind. And so I made this little house with a kind of structure behind it that it's static, but it reminded me, it was the beginnings, it reminded me of this little painting I had seen. And I began to become fascinated with the notion of, okay, we've got art and nature, what's that relationship? And then there's art and technology, or art and tool making, what's that relationship? And what's the relationship between art and science, and art and magical thinking? Since the two have looped around each other, almost like the structure of DNA, since the beginning of time. And I think we're in another one of those periods. So that little house, the little shanty house, was a sort of emblem of a certain kind of shift and change. These two pieces were designed in the late 70s and built in the late 70s and the 80s. They were temporary. At that time, we were able to, somebody would say, here's a couple $1,000s, here's a site, build something. After the exhibition is done, we will destroy it, but you get a chance to build. The piece on the left is a series of walls that are how many meters high? 6, 7, 8, 9 meters high, approximately. A series of walls that you would climb through, almost like an aerial labyrinth, and then climb back out. The piece on the right is called 100 Small Rooms. And again, inside, it's a labyrinth. And you have to go from little porthole to porthole, finding your way up to the top. And again, that's about 9 meters high. At the same time as I was building, I was also drawing, because I knew that I couldn't build everything I was thinking, and I didn't want my thoughts to be constrained. I wanted to imagine whatever I wanted to imagine. On the left, there's a possible structure where you would go down it, and you would keep going down a series of steps, jumping down, and gradually you would get to a point where you couldn't go any further, but maybe you couldn't get back up again. And on the right, there's something called the Garden of Scripts. And that drawing is, I took a lot of languages throughout all history and I made them into topiary gardens, as though you could walk through history, but you would be seeing topiary shrubs in a garden, and you would be walking through all these different languages throughout history. These are pieces that I will never build, but I could think them up. And I believe in thinking up something, even if you can't build it. I believe in imagining, even if it's impossible to bring it into being. And some more of these kinds of architectural fantasies in which I'm starting to sort of swerve into industrial images. And on the left, there's the machine that makes the world. And on the left, I'm combining architecture and a labyrinth with this series of steel doors that you move through. And when you get to the labyrinth in the back, it's on wheels and you're spun into it and spun back out again. So at some point, the wheel and motion begins to take precedence over simple architecture. On the right, one of my favorite pieces, The 1001 Nights in the Mansion of Bliss. And that is all about machinery and technology and industry. And what I thought was, if I could find a metaphor for the journey that human beings have made from, let's say, an arrowhead which you use to, that you can sort of kill your prey, and it gives you some control over your environment, to, let's say, the nuclear bomb. What was that journey? What was that technology about? And always this notion of a turbine or some sort of device that spins and harnesses wind power, and also can be a tool that destroys as well, a cutting tool. And what I came to believe was that technology is, has both and. It's both very positive, that it gives us control over our environment, and at the same time, it can be very destructive. And the two wrap around each other like the structure of DNA. They wrap tightly around each other. And every time we move forward in this amazing journey that human beings have made from the arrowhead to the present time, we also create unforeseen destruction or unforeseen results. The two pieces, I found that amusement park, carnival architecture worked in that zone between technology and factories and industry, and and it was fun, and it gave people access. Amusement park architecture gave people access to the machine, where they could experience G forces. And but I was also very interested in how magical thinking related to technology, and what that journey out of magic, and how that affected where we are today. And I think when I began this investigation, I thought that science had won, and that magical thinking had been sort of put down. But then I thought, well, but we always want our fortune told. There's always things in our life that we can't predict. So that's when we use magical thinking. I wish, I wish, I wish. Now I realize that even more than before, magical thinking has come to the fore, and that in the world that we live in, we're always hoping for the best right now, hoping, and we're relying once again on, while we want technology to save us as we wait, we're relying on our wishes and our hopes and our magical thinking. All right. And so this piece, which is outdoors, has little bits and pieces of all kinds of industrial experiments. And I think I read once where someone said the difference between art and everything else is that art is useless and everything else has a useful purpose. And I thought, well, what if I upend that? What if I use tools and reference to tools and make art out of it? Because so many tools are really great looking. I mean, the wheel for one, or the turbine for another, but all sorts of things are. And so if you look, are really beautiful to look at. So why aren't they art? Well, I'm going to incorporate them in a fantasy piece that does nothing. It's true. It doesn't really work, but it has all these different little elements that reference different inventions throughout time. And so this piece does that. And if you look at it carefully, you can find little references to inventions having to do with radios and electricity and all sorts of things. And then I sort of swerved back to architecture. But once I kind of leave the machines, I'm still referencing parts of architecture and parts of machines. And so these two pieces, the one on the left, I thought of as a series of stepped bowls that could be like flying saucers, or like some sort of device that's scanning the sky, looking for aliens, or just looking at the stars. And then there's ribbons that are around it, and I talk about it as a DNA ribbon. And here in a library, There's a kind of conical vortex with stairs wrapped around it. And it's about the unfurling of knowledge and going up steps and having this sort of aha moment, and things start twirling around and cascading. And these are a series of drawings, and I don't want to go on too long, but you can see that I also take a lot of pleasure in making drawings about my imagination and my fantasies. This has to do with some images that I saw of birds, starlings that make the most amazing patterns in the sky. And so I took some of those images and I put turbines and machines into it and made a series of drawings. These are two very large architectural, industrial, permanent pieces. One is in Nashville and one is on the East River in New York City. And when I work outdoors, I try very hard to make a relationship between the place itself, the context, and the art that I'm going to put there, so that it doesn't just look exactly like, quote, art, but it begins to have a conversation with the world around it. And in these two pieces, the world around it is very industrial, very urban, there isn't much nature. And so it's about saying, okay, look at this, it's art, but then look at something else that we're saying is not art. Isn't that interesting too? And so that the world comes in as an influence, and then you look at the art, and then you go back to the world. And, I feel like, for instance, I love all those satellites that are up in the sky. And I have a particular relationship to the stars in the sense that I think they're wondrous. I think they're extraordinary. And in past history, people have looked at the stars all the time to try to orient themselves, to try to locate themselves, both on the earth and in the universe. And now we don't look up so much. It's hard, I guess, because there's so much light pollution, and because we're living this intense world where it's all about today, today, today. Nothing about something larger, except for some scientists and astronomers and so when I was a young child, I remember going out on a summer night, and I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. I lay down in the grass and I looked up at the sky, and it was amazing. And I thought, all that up there, that's so vast, and I'm so tiny. I am so tiny. And how can I ever matter in that vastness of the universe? And then I got up and I found a stick and I found some concrete and I wrote my name. And in a sense, my journey has been that back and forth between there's the vastness of the universe, everything is meaningless but marvelous, marvelous, and I'm nothing, and then no, I want to be something. And that, I think, is the kind of ricochet that we all go through. And sometimes the vastness of the universe is really comforting and it's marvelous, and other times it's frightening because we understand how teeny, tiny, tiny, tiny we are. And we know that even more. But I like to play with that. And so these two pieces are about playing with comets and stars and moments of they're both in airport. One's in an airport and one is in a college. And one's called Star Sifter. And it really has to do with comets and energy. And the other is in an airport, and it's about movement, but also moving through the night sky and the stars. And so also I like science fiction, old time science fiction. And these big satellite dishes, I just think they're beautiful. I think they're works of sculpture. And so I use these kinds of vortex dishes, almost as though they're cups that can be filled, or they're empty, they're scanning the sky, looking up. And I just sort of playfully cite them. These are out in the Midwest. where people sometimes think they see aliens. And so there's sculptures that are set there at airports and in different community centers. This is one of my more recent sci-fi pieces down in Coral Gables, where this flower called the passion flower has grown huge, and it's got legs, sort of like it's a kind of robotic spider, and it sits there, and it's very opulent, and it's also a little sci-fi. All right, and I'm using color. Sometimes I use color. So at some point, I found these drawings by Leonardo called the Deluge series. And what I am so always been so intrigued by Leonardo was that he was both an artist and a scientist, and he blurred it. He used his imagination and his curiosity to look at everything. And he didn't judge himself. He didn't prejudge himself and say, I can't look at that. I can't think about that. It's if it aroused his curiosity, he was going to investigate it and try to figure it out. And the Deluge series, where he was trying to understand water in motion and wind in motion and make these drawings and try to figure it out, I think is really the beginning again of science and technology and his curiosity. When I saw this, I thought, how extraordinary. So this was way back in the 80s, and he called it the deluge. So he was really thinking about how marvelous water is and how powerful water is, but it's also the deluge, which is when the world becomes, when there are hurricanes and, biblical apocalyptic moments happen. This is called the Leonardo swirl. It was made in the 80s. It's very simple. And it was made in the back of my loft, but it's my beginnings of trying to like play with motion and ribbons of movement and swirls. And it's called the Leonardo swirl because I looked at Leonardo's drawing and I tried to kind of copy it and make a sculpture out of it. Okay, these are images. So what I do as an artist is I look at the world. I troll the internet for exciting images, and then I save them in my library of images. And this is what I tell my students as well. You see something out in the world, you don't know why you like it, but you like it, photograph it, put it in, and store it. You see something on the internet you like, store it in your library. And then you go back and you sort of say to yourself, what is it that about these things that I'm so curious about? Is this my brain trying to, why do I have all these things? How am I going to use them when I make my art? And so here are some of the images that I have used to make my art. And some of them are very scientific and technological, and some of them are very mundane. They're an amusement park. They're a beautiful flowing fashion. There are all sorts of things and I'm not ashamed to be high or low, to look at a cartoon or look at a scientific diagram. These are drawings that I made that, that eventually became the twisters. And so now we're going to talk about the twisters. All right, and these are the one on the left is the first large twister. It was made, I'm not sure, 2008, 2007, sometime in there. And I had been thinking about weather patterns and tornadoes and hurricanes for a long time. And then I found the moment to start drawing them on the computer and beginning to go back and take the Leonardo swirl and really do something with it. And so this begins this series. And what I would like to say about this series as we move through it is that way back, and we can stay with this for a moment, way back in the early 70s when I put the fans on the sand and I was a young artist and I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know the 40 some years that I would make art, but that early work was the beginning of this journey that ends up, and I don't think it's ended yet, I hope, but in the Twisters series. And so as young artists, students, scientists, I would imagine that you would like to know how we go about doing these. And I think there's one more drawing that you can see. And so these pieces are, on the contrary, they're thought up in my head, they're imagined, but then they go through a rigorous engineering. They are on the inside, they're structurally very sound. And I work with engineers, I go with a lot of different, a team that also then builds it. And we go through a lot of computer drawing, computer technology, and computer fabrication. Machines then fabricate what I have drawn to be very much, if you see a drawing that I do and I say, that's what I want it to look like, then through the marvels of computer technology, that's what it looks like. And so we might make something that looks as though it's very turbulent and chaotic and perhaps unstable, but in fact, it's not. And so it's sort of like, in again, a kind of magic, but not the magic of magical thinking, the magic of you see something and you think it looks one way, but in fact, it really is very stable and very solid. In 2014, shows you Park Avenue in New York City, and from 52nd, 53rd up to 57th Street, and a series of, it's called the Paper Chase, Park Avenue Paper Chase. And I thought about, what if there was paper that blew up Park Avenue and it would stop and it would land there and then it would blow some more? Or what if the wind visualized itself? What would it look like? And so each of the streets has a different piece that is a variation on this fantasy. And this was sort of the formal beginnings of the Twister Turbulence series. And this is very much in an urban environment. And so it relates to the urban energy of the center of New York City. And this really is the heart of New York City. The other heart is Times Square. One is more sedate and the other is more raucous. So this is the more sedate Park Avenue, where sort of the world meets. All right, then these sculptures left Park Avenue and they went around different parts of the world. This is Chatsworth outside of London, and suddenly the cyclone twist is in nature and it's having a conversation with nature. Frankly, my feeling is that these pieces want to live in nature, that their conversation is with the trees, is with the compositional branching um, um, sort of nature of the trees, and also of nature itself as it swirls and forms spiral patterns and wind patterns and water patterns. And that this is where these pieces actually feel most at home, that they really are having a conversation with nature. This is the crew, and it's really important for everyone to see that I'm not just one artist, but that over time, and it's a slow process, but I always had a team, or I always had help. And I was never ashamed to ask for help. If I didn't know how to do something, but I wanted to know, I would ask for help. I would ask people that knew. So this is the group. Now, these people are paid to work, and it's now like an artist fabrication studio, and these are some of the people that work on the sculptures. And now you see various pieces that relate to the turbulence wind turbine series. And if they have some reference also to flowers and things like that, some people call them rosettes, there is some reference to the structure of nature. And these are variations on the theme. And now you have walked through or will walk through and have a tour, and you will see each of these pieces and what they are doing. This one is, if we could stay with this for a moment, it's called Devil Whirl. Yes, it relates to a little dust devil that's twirling and whirling and moving and zigging and zagging, but it also relates to dance. And what I would like to say is while these pieces have as their relationship the movement of water and wind, and it's not always something that's frightening. We all love to see tornadoes at a distance. We love to see hurricanes from above, which make these beautiful swirling patterns, which is the pattern of the galaxies and the patterns of water. They're not always frightening, terrifying, but I will tell you a story about myself again as a young woman, very young, probably 13, 14 years old. I lived in a little town in the middle in Pennsylvania. And one night in February, it was very, very warm for a change. And I had the windows open, and the wind, I could hear the wind. And I crawled out my window and I got onto my front lawn and I began to dance in the wind. And I was all by myself. No one was around, and I wasn't feeling self conscious, or I was feeling euphoric. And it was as though the wind was moving through me, and I was talking to the wind. I was talking to the night. I was talking to the universe as I knew it. And so a lot of these pieces also have their basis, their beginnings in my own body movement or the body movement of dance, and that sense that you have of when you're moving and dancing, that you are kind of in a state of euphoria. And Devil World really exhibits that as much as anything. All right, now these are pieces that you will have encountered when you went through your tour. And each one is, this is called Alien Twister because it's kind of got a little top saucer on one side. And they're just various variations on the theme. And spinning tops is the first toy that we all get, a gyroscope and a spinning top. And a gyroscope tells us something about the universe and about movement and about gravity. And so I keep going back to things that I think of as sort of primary and also flying saucers. So this is a combination of a flying saucer, but they don't move. In this case, it's static. Now, I'm going to tell a story at the very end of my talk. And I think we all ask ourselves, or our parents ask us, why do you want to be an artist? Or why do you want to be whatever it is you want to be? But in the case of art, what does art do? It's meaningless, it's useless. And no matter what your investigation is, it's kind of useless, we say. No, it's not going to make, it's there. Why is it there? But it's always been there. That's the sort of interesting thing. It's always been there from the beginning, from the cave paintings. It's always been there. And people seem almost as though it's deep within their DNA psyche to make art. And I keep asking myself that question, even though I've done it all my life. Well, occasionally I will cycle back and I will say, why have I done this? I went to India in 2008, and I went to see some incredible architecture that I had looked at in books all my life. Some of them were these amazing observatories in Delhi and Jaipur. And another was this gate, which was the entrance to the old city of Jaipur. And I was on a tour, and I got out of the tour bus, and I'm standing in the street, and the tour guide kept wanting to take me to a souvenir shop. And I said to him, look, I've come all this way. It's taken me years and years to get here. I just want to step out and look at this incredible building, this incredible gate, because I'll never be back. And I just want to stare at it with my own eyes. Leave me alone. And this particular gate was where the women who were in the harem, who could never leave the harem, would sit behind and look out at the world. And they would see the world that they couldn't enter, and they would sit behind this exquisitely beautiful gate. So I was staring at it and thinking about that. And I felt this tug on my shirt. And I was thinking, if I could just, it's someone wanting something, and it's been so many years, I just want to be here and stare. I just want to be quiet and meditate. And the tugging kept happening on my shirt. And I turned, and there was a young woman. She was probably 16, 17, 18 years old. And she had this scar that went from the top of her throat all the way down her stomach, all the way down. Someone had cut her. She had recovered, but she had this huge scar. And that's all she had in the entire world, nothing else. There I was, this privileged woman, looking at this gate, and I was going to fly away. I would never see her again. And I realized at that moment when I was looking at her that she was the reason why I make art. She was the reason, I didn't know it, but that was the reason why I went to India. And I came home and I worked on this drawing, and I took the gate and I made it over and over and over again. And I put it behind all these ruffles, like an incredibly beautiful, beautiful flowing drapery dress. And then this big turbine with all of these sort of little fantasy pinwheels. It took me about a year to do this drawing. It's about 10 feet, I think 10 feet tall, maybe less. And I made it for her. I made it because of her. And I realized in myself that that's why I do it. I do it to put something out in the world that I don't understand. The moment something happens, I can't do anything but maybe save the universe. I'm making amends. I'm trying to pacify you. I'm trying to make a token of memory of something that happened, even if I must. And I think that's what human beings have always done since the beginning of time. Even if they feel small and inconsequential, they must make this action, this almost gift to the universe. Finally, I'm going to read a poem on the upside. And this poem is aspirational. I found it years ago, and when I read it, I say to myself, this is what I would like my art to be like this poem. And it goes like this. It's by a man named W.S. Merwin. He is an American poet. He was living in Hawaii. It's called Utterance. And he says, sitting over words very late, I have heard a kind of whispered sighing, not far, like a night wind in pines, or like the sea in the dark. The echo of everything that has ever been spoken, still spinning its one syllable between the earth and silence. All right, I'm ready to take questions. Hi. And I hate looking at myself, so I'm not going to do it, but if there's anyone left in the room, come at.
Thank you, Alice. This was fantastic. You are fantastic. I think I will start with one question to get us going, and then I will give the word to you to continue the conversation. I was drawn to a couple of things you said. For instance, many of your pieces are somehow in the intersection between architecture and sculpture. And I was wondering, in what way do you think your father, who was both an architect and an engineer, has influenced you as an artist?
Great question. Well, right now, of course, fathers are, well, mothers are what? Okay, it's not a hard question to answer, but my father was an architect engineer, and he was also a big reader. He was encyclopedic in his thinking. And he's the one who, when I was 8, he gave me Bullfinch's Mythology and expected me to read it, which I couldn't. And when I was 11, he went to New York City and he bought me 50 books, and they were from everything that he could think of. And he said, if you read these 50 books, I'll buy you 50 more. So he was always throwing out these challenges to me. He wasn't one of those people that reinforced every time I did something. He was always challenging me. But when I was a very little girl, and I think this is the important story. Um, we lived in this little, he came home from World War II and he started a construction company the year I was born. It was very tiny in the beginning. And we lived in this little tiny house, a tract house, and he would rush home from work and I would wait for him. And he would go up to a table and start working on this tiny little model. And then he'd give me graph paper and I would try to draw what he was building. And then he'd say, okay, here's a ruler, scale it. And I was about 3 or 4 years old. And I would wait for him every day. I couldn't wait, and he would be making this thing. It was so interesting and beautiful. And what he did is when he finished this model where he landscaped it and where I was making all these little drawings, he gave me the model as my toy, and he built the house that I grew up in. And so I very early learned the relationship between conceiving things, drawing it, planning it, and then what happened then building it on a large scale, and then all the things that go on inside this piece of architecture. So you could say that I was sort of imprinted like a duck. And I also had a mother who thought, rightly or wrongly, that I was extraordinarily special. She had waited for my father to come home from the war to have me. And this was going to be her whatever. And so I just lucked out with my parents in ways that a lot of people don't. And for that, I am eternally grateful. I had both of them, on one side challenging and at the other reinforcing. And whether it worked or not, I don't know, but I do know that they gave me a wonderful life.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And I think we have more questions here for you. Maria, please.
I have one question for you. If you had to choose one, which of your own artworks is your favorite?
Of my own or?
Of your own work, yeah.
Of my own.
If you have to choose only one.
Oh, it's the one I've yet to make, which I might not ever get to make, but it was I designed it as a series of spinning platforms on a large scale. It was going to be on a hilltop on this island called Molokai outside in Hawaii, and it was going to speak to the sky and be all these. It is like a gigantic Venn diagram of spinning platforms that turn themselves up in the air and then push themselves back down again. And that's my fave, and I don't know if I'll ever get to make it, but I thought I was, but who knows now. But anyway, it's the next one.
Good answer. Yes, and we have some more questions here.
Well, me and my classmates wrote some questions for you, and the first one is, what inspires you currently?
Well, I think I'm still in the Turbulence series. What I think is this, if I could be perfectly honest. We all knew that there were things like climate change, and we also knew that we were living now in a very complex world, and whether global, and that something that happened in the far reaches of the earth, in some place, were going to influence what was happening somewhere else. That was clear to us for some time. And whereas maybe even 100 or 150 years ago, you could have something going on in the jungles of Indonesia, for instance, and it wouldn't necessarily affect someone in Sweden, maybe, but in a less complicated way. And this notion of this kind of Venn complex diagram that I'm talking about, where I had really thought about it before we were hit with what's happening now, is where I am. The only, I mean, but just like as an historian or a theoretician, or you're in the laboratory, it's one thing when you're talking about it and you're thinking about it. It's another when it's at your front door. And so I'm being perfectly honest. It was really interesting for me to say, oh, these turbulence pieces and these sort of intersecting circular platforms and all this, they're really, it's art, it's really interesting, and it's about the way the world is. That's fine. You know, oh, I'm really glad because I've landed in the right place here philosophically at this point. But the truth is that we're also in the middle of it. And as I said, that sort of ricochet between a theoretical proposition and the reality of having to live through it it's humbling. It's very humbling. Okay.
Yes, the second question was, what work of yours had the most unexpected feedback?
That they would like it, but they didn't. But I mean, a lot of people liked it. I don't want to just say, but there was more negative feedback than I expected. I think that like everything, you have to do what you believe in and what you think is the next right thing to do. And then you have to take your knocks. And just to, you know, people will say to me, well, how do I become an artist? Or how do I stay an artist? And, you know, these questions. This isn't, it isn't a choice. It is what you are. And I was listening to Frank Sinatra talk about it yesterday. You are that thing 24/7. You are that thing whether you're in fashion or you're not, whether people think you're great or they don't. You can't do anything else except the next so-called thing that you need to do. And you do it, you do it despite everything. And I don't know why that is. It just is. And I would say, again, I'm going to speak a piece of poetry from Oscar Wilde that I say to myself all the time. And I said to a college the other day, commencement, Oscar Wilde said, "For my own part, the only thing I could do was to love you. I knew that if I allowed myself to hate you, that in the dry desert of existence over which I have been forced to wander and am wandering still, every well of water would prove poisoned at its source." And what I would say is that if you find that pursuit or that passion that you cannot do without, without it, the water would be poisoned. Then you are a lucky person. In some ways, you're also, fated to have a rather complex life. But the point is that this is not, you can't just every time someone says something negative fall apart. At the same time, you can't also buy into every positive thing that's said. You have to kind of keep a sort of clarity within yourself. It's not easy, but you have to do it.
Yes, wonderful. And I think we have the last question. Is it so? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. The final question. Who is your favorite artist?
Oh, well, I have lots of favorite artists. It's a question I ask my students, and some of them are anonymous, I mean, those observatories in India have been extraordinary. So if you ever can, if you Google Delhi Observatory, Jaipur Observatory, there is a Richard Serra. I hate to bring him up because he can be a real whatever, but he has a series of pieces at Dia, which are these torqued, curved walls. And when I go there once every 15 or 20 years, I go, oh shit, man, this is amazing. There's also a Mike Kaiser piece up there, which is this deep, deep cuts in the ground. They are rectilinear, but it's that deep, deep well. And I go, oh God. There are, Kiefer. There's some Kiefer paintings that when I look at them, I just say, this is a consummate artist. There's a woman named Julie Maratu, who is a painter here in the States that I think is an extraordinary painter. I mean, I have many, many favorite artists. There's a beautiful painting called Flaming June by an English painter at the turn of the century. And if you ever find it, his name is Lord Leighton. It is so delicious. It's like a delicious Georgia O'Keeffe. I mean, I think art can be delicious and seductive, and it has to be beautiful. And it also has to take you to very, very deep places within yourself. All of Late Goya. I mean, you asked me who's my favorite. I'm telling you many. Late Goya, I think, is amazing. So there are a few. Okay.
There are a few. But I can say you are definitely one of our favorites.
Thank you so much. Thanks for putting up with me. And you got me in the morning where I have all this coffee, and so I could talk forever. And I apologize for going over time. Okay.
Well, you are fantastic, and we have indeed learned a lot today. Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you all for joining us here at the National Museum for Science and Technology, and also for you who have followed us remotely. Now, the next event will be something you all have been waiting for: coffee, tea, and cinnamon buns.